There is a specific kind of strategic blindness that afflicts governments, analysts, and media institutions at exactly the moment when clarity is most urgently needed. It is not the blindness of ignorance, it is the blindness of frameworks, inherited assumptions about how wars work, how deterrence holds, and how rational actors behave, that were built for a world that no longer exists. What is unfolding right now between Israel and Iran is not a bilateral military confrontation that can be managed by clever diplomacy and carefully calibrated strikes. It is a demonstration of how interconnected, multi domain regional warfare operates when the underlying architecture of deterrence has already been quietly eroding for years. Most of the commentary you will encounter will treat this as a crisis that can be resolved. What the military and strategic record actually suggests is something far more structurally significant.
Let us be precise about what happened over this past weekend and into Monday, June 8th. Israeli fighter jets struck targets inside Iran. Iran responded by launching ballistic missiles. Then, according to reporting from the New York Times, citing two Israeli military officials with direct knowledge of the situation, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ordered preparations for a substantially larger retaliatory strike against Iran and then stood that strike down following serious pressure from President Donald Trump. Simultaneously, the Houthis in Yemen launched their own ballistic missile strikes targeting Israel, announced a complete blockade of Israeli maritime traffic in the Red Sea, and released footage of the Falastin 2 ballistic missile being fired in the direction of Tel Aviv. Iran canceled all domestic flights and locked down its airspace. A tanker vessel approximately 15 nautical miles off the coast of Masira Island in Oman caught fire and required crew evacuation, under circumstances that strongly suggest Iranian involvement, given Tehran's prior statements threatening any vessel attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz. And Lebanese targets continue to receive Israeli airstrikes throughout the same period. If you read that paragraph quickly, it sounds like a busy news cycle. If you read it slowly and understand the operational and strategic geography involved, it begins to look like something qualitatively different, a multi-front, multi-domain conflict that is no longer episodic but continuous, and that is straining the mechanisms that theoretically exist to keep it from expanding further. Begin with the ballistic missiles, because they are the most strategically revealing element of this exchange. When Iran fires ballistic missiles at Israel and the Houthis independently fire ballistic missiles at Israel, these are not simply acts of political signaling. They are operational demonstrations of a distributed missile architecture that no conventional air campaign can neutralize quickly or cheaply. The IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, has spent the better part of 3 decades building a missile force that is specifically designed to operate under conditions of degraded infrastructure, dispersed across hardened and concealed launch sites with redundant command and control systems that do not depend on centralized nodes that can be struck from the air. The Houthis have received a subset of this capability, sufficient to extend the threat perimeter across the Red Sea and into the Gulf of Aden. The range of these systems, their relative accuracy in more recent generations, and most critically their sheer numbers, present an attrition problem for any air defense system, including the layered Israeli system that combines Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow interceptors. This is not an academic observation. Every interceptor fired to defeat an incoming ballistic missile costs orders of magnitude more than the missile it destroys. Arrow 3 interceptors, designed specifically for exo-atmospheric interceptive ballistic threats, carry a unit cost estimated in the range of $1 to $2 million per interceptor. Iranian Shahab and Khaibar-Shikan class ballistic missiles cost a fraction of that. The Houthi Falastin 2, derived from Iranian technology, costs less still. This arithmetic does not immediately decide the outcome of any single exchange. Over an extended conflict, across multiple simultaneous fronts generating persistent missile fire, it creates a depletion dynamic that cannot be resolved by tactical brilliance or interception rate percentages. Magazines run low. Resupply takes time. Production capacity is finite. This is the industrial logic of modern missile warfare, and it is one that public discussion almost entirely ignores in favor of dramatic footage of interceptors streaking across night skies.
There is an additional complexity. US officials denied that American forces intercepted any Iranian ballistic missiles during this most recent exchange, a notable contrast to earlier phases of Iranian missile attacks on Israel in April 2024, during which American naval and air assets played a substantial role in defeating the Iranian salvo. The US statement clarified that while American forces did not assist in the active defense of Israel this time, there was coordination between the Israeli Defense Forces and US Central Command. The distinction matters. In the April 2024 exchange, the combined US, Israeli, Jordanian, Saudi air defense network intercepted the vast majority of Iranian drones and missiles before they reached Israeli territory. That performance was widely described as a near total success.
What it actually demonstrated was the consumption of significant interceptor stocks, the activation of multiple allied air defense systems simultaneously, and the requirement for US assets to backstop Israeli capacity. If American forces are no longer participating in active interception, whether by policy choice, repositioning, or other considerations, the burden on Israeli air defenses in any sustained exchange increases substantially. The report that Netanyahu ordered and then cancelled preparations for a much larger retaliatory strike against Iran is the single most strategically significant data point to emerge from this episode. Not because of what it tells us about Netanyahu's intentions, which are subject to interpretation and domestic political pressures, but because of what it reveals about the structural relationship between Israeli decision-making and American strategic constraints.
Israel is an extraordinarily capable military force within its operational environment. Its Air Force has demonstrated repeatedly the ability to conduct long-range precision strikes in complex airspace. Its intelligence services have a sustained record of penetrating adversary organizations at extraordinary depth. Its ground forces are experienced and highly trained. But Israel is also a small state with limited strategic depth, a defense economy that is deeply dependent on American resupply and political support, and an exposed civilian population concentrated in a relatively compact geographic area. These are not weaknesses that can be overcome by tactical excellence. They are structural realities that constrain how far Israeli escalation can go before the costs become prohibitive.
When the New York Times reports that Netanyahu was talked back from a larger strike by Trump, this is not simply a story about one leader persuading another. It is a story about the architecture of deterrence and alliance management under conditions of acute stress. The United States has clear interests in preventing the conflict from escalating to a point that would require direct American military involvement, threaten Gulf oil infrastructure, further destabilize a region where American force posture has been gradually diminishing, or create conditions for a broader regional war that Washington currently lacks the political will and arguably the industrial capacity to sustain. Trump's intervention, if accurately reported, reflects those interests.
But here is the strategic tension that this dynamic creates. Every time Israeli escalation is constrained by American pressure, it communicates something to Tehran. Not necessarily that Israel is weak, but that there exists a ceiling above which Israeli responses will not go, at least not without explicit American endorsement. Adversaries who understand where ceilings are can calibrate their own actions to operate just below them. This is not a new dynamic in international security. It is, however, a dynamic that becomes increasingly difficult to manage as the frequency and intensity of exchanges increases, as Iranian domestic political pressures build, and as the Houthi and Hezbollah fronts continue generating simultaneous pressure.
Lebanon deserves specific attention because the ongoing Israeli strikes there are not occurring in isolation from the Iran dimension. They are part of a coherent Iranian strategic design, even if that design has been significantly disrupted by Israeli operations over the past 18 months. Hezbollah, at its peak, was arguably the most capable non-state military organization in the world, possessing a missile and rocket inventory estimated at over 100,000 projectiles of varying range and precision, a trained manpower base developed over decades of Iranian support, and a sophisticated tunnel and fortification infrastructure throughout southern Lebanon. Israeli operations have substantially degraded these capabilities. Senior Hezbollah leadership, including Hassan Nasrallah, was killed. Weapons stocks were attrited. Command networks were disrupted. The organization has not been destroyed, but it has been set back significantly from where it was in 2023. The question that matters for the current situation is not whether Hezbollah has been weakened, it has, but whether it retains sufficient capacity to serve as an additional pressure point on Israel during a period when Iran is also conducting ballistic missile strikes and the Houthis are operating in the Red Sea. Even a degraded Hezbollah conducting intermittent rocket and anti-tank missile fire from southern Lebanon, while Israeli airstrikes attempt to suppress remaining launch infrastructure, contributes to the cumulative strain on Israeli air defense systems, intelligence collection priorities, and military personnel tempo. Simultaneous multi-front pressure is a well-understood military concept. Its effectiveness does not require each front to be at maximum intensity. It requires that each front demand attention, resources, and response simultaneously, preventing any single front from being addressed with the full weight of available force. The Iranian strategic concept, visible in the architecture of the axis of resistance, was precisely to build this kind of distributed multi-front pressure capacity. Hezbollah from Lebanon, Hamas from Gaza, Houthi forces from Yemen, Iraqi militia groups from Iraq, Iranian ballistic and cruise missiles as the strategic reserve. The individual components have been degraded to varying degrees over the past 2 years of conflict. The concept itself remains operative, and the Houthi front in particular has demonstrated that geographic distance does not prevent operational relevance. A Yemeni movement threatening shipping in the Red Sea and firing ballistic missiles at Tel Aviv from over 2,000 kilometers away is a strategic reality that virtually no Western defense planner had fully internalized before 2023. The ship attacked near Oman is a thread that connects directly to the global economic stakes of this conflict. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of global oil trade transits, has long been identified as the choke point whose closure would immediately and severely affect energy markets worldwide. Iran has repeatedly threatened to close it and has demonstrated, through naval provocations, mine-laying operations in previous years, and seizure of vessels, that it possesses the capability to significantly disrupt traffic there, even if it cannot sustain a complete closure indefinitely against a determined American naval response. The incident near Masira Island fits a pattern. Iran has explicitly threatened vessels transiting the strait. A vessel subsequently suffers an unexplained fire and explosion requiring crew evacuation. The causal connection has not been formally established, but the strategic logic is not complicated. If Iran is conducting a campaign of graduated escalation, ballistic missile strikes combined with maritime interdiction threats, then the economic pressure that this generates on regional and global energy markets is not a side effect. It is a deliberate instrument of leverage. Energy prices, shipping insurance costs, and the security calculus of every state with maritime economic interests in the Persian Gulf are affected by the perception that Iranian threats against shipping are credible and actively being executed. This matters for American strategic calculations, for Saudi calculations, and for the calculations of every Asian economy that depends on Gulf energy exports. Japan, South Korea, China, India, all of these states import substantial quantities of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. A sustained disruption of that traffic does not only affect Israel or the United States. It creates pressure on global energy markets that eventually translates into political pressure on governments to either resolve the conflict or distance themselves from the parties causing the disruption. Understanding who benefits from that political dynamic in the medium to long term requires thinking clearly about which state in this conflict has more to gain from extended economic warfare and which has more to lose. There is a diplomatic dimension to this situation that deserves serious scrutiny rather than reflexive optimism. Trump's claim that a significant peace deal is imminent should be evaluated against the actual conditions on the ground
and the structural interests of the parties involved. Iran is in the midst of a ballistic missile exchange with Israel. Its airspace is shut down in anticipation of further strikes. The IRGC is releasing footage of its missile launches. These are not the behavioral signatures of a government about to conclude a comprehensive agreement that would require it to fundamentally alter its regional strategic posture. This is not to say that negotiations are impossible or that diplomatic contact is not occurring. Intelligence communities and back channels operate in ways that are not visible in public reporting, and statements made for domestic audiences on all sides frequently diverge from actual negotiating positions. But a realistic assessment of what any negotiated agreement would require reveals the depth of the obstacle. For Iran, the existing nuclear program represents decades of investment, technological development, and strategic deterrent value. Any agreement that a US administration could present as a significant achievement would require Iranian concessions on enrichment levels, stockpile limits, and inspection access that the Iranian leadership would face enormous domestic pressure to resist. For Israel, any agreement that leaves Iran with a meaningful enrichment infrastructure leaves open the path to weaponization, which Israeli security doctrine has consistently treated as existential. The space between these positions is not easily bridged by diplomatic creativity, particularly when both sides are simultaneously exchanging missile fire. The more strategically coherent reading of what is happening is that the parties are calibrating escalation thresholds, probing how far each side will go, what responses will be triggered, where the American red lines actually sit, and whether any of the existing pressure is sufficient to change the fundamental calculus. This is not a process that typically produces clean diplomatic outcomes. It is a process that produces either a mutually agreed pause based on exhaustion and cost-benefit calculation, or a further escalation event that forces a qualitative change in the conflict's character. The Saudi dimension is worth noting, even in what appears to have been a minor episode. The Saudi Ministry of Defense issued a statement clarifying that the Prince Sultan Air Base was not targeted, that an air raid alert in the Al-Kharj governorate was triggered by a Houthi ballistic missile launched from Yemen that disappeared near the Saudi border. The speed and specificity of that clarification reflects Saudi sensitivity about being perceived as a target in this conflict. Saudi Arabia has been engaged in a gradual normalization process with both Israel and Iran over the past 2 years, navigating a position that allows it to maintain economic relationships and regional relationships without being drawn directly into the military confrontation. The prospect of Houthi or Iranian missiles landing on or near Saudi territory would immediately complicate that balance, generate domestic political pressure within the kingdom, and force difficult choices about the depth of Saudi cooperation with American and Israeli military operations. The broader Gulf state calculation is similarly complex. States like the UAE, Bahrain, and Qatar host significant American military infrastructure, while simultaneously maintaining economic and diplomatic relationships with Iran and conducting their own hedging strategies in anticipation of a regional order that may look significantly different from the one that existed in 2020. Every escalation event in this conflict forces these states to recalibrate their exposure and their options. The Houthi maritime blockade threat, directed at Israeli shipping, does not stay neatly within those boundaries when the vessels affected, the ports involved, and the financial institutions processing the transactions are deeply integrated into a global economic system in which Gulf states are major participants.